Hello, and welcome to Why Do We Do That, a psychology podcast that deconstructs the human experience through the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others who apply psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. Why do so many well-intentioned parenting strategies seem to make things worse for children with ADHD? When a child struggles with emotional outbursts, ignores directions, or melts down over seemingly small things, our instinct is often to explain, ask questions, or help them understand what they should do differently next time. It feels like good parenting. But what if some of those instincts are actually working against us? Today, I'm joined by ADHD expert Ryan Wexelblatt, who has spent years helping families better understand how the ADHD brain works and how parents can create calmer homes without constant power struggles. Ryan is a licensed clinical social worker, certified school social worker, and father to a son with ADHD and learning differences. He is the founder and director of ADHD Dude, an internationally recognized resource for parent training, professional education, and in-person programs for males with ADHD. He is a regular contributor to Attitude magazine, and his ADHD Dude YouTube channel has received over 1.1 million views and continues to grow each month. In this conversation, we explore why ADHD is about much more than simply having trouble paying attention. Ryan explains what's really happening when kids struggle with emotional outbursts, resist transitions, or seem completely unmotivated by things like homework and chores. We also talk about why some of the parenting strategies that feel the most natural, like asking, "Why did you do that?" or trying to reason with a child in the middle of a meltdown, can actually make things worse. Most importantly, Ryan shares practical, evidence-based strategies that parents can start using right away to create calmer interactions and help their child become more confident, independent, and emotionally resilient. Whether you're parenting a child with ADHD, teaching one, or simply hoping to better understand someone you love, I think you'll come away with a completely different perspective on what these kids need most from the adults in their lives. So, why do we do that? Let's find out. Okay, today I am joined by Ryan Wexelblatt. Thank you so much for being with me here today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Today we're going to be talking about parenting and ADHD. So if you want a primer for this episode, you can go back and listen to episode 47 of Why Do We Do That with Stephen Ferrone, where we talk about ADHD in general. You could also go back to episode 60 and listen to Executive Skills in Children with Richard and Colin Guare. Ryan's specialty deals with behavioral interventions for ADHD kids. So the kind of things that you would, as a parent, do in conversation, at home, rules and policies, how to manage emotions, things like that. So we're probably not going to talk a lot about the other area of dealing with ADHD, which is the medical side, the pharmaceutical side. So we're going to be focused today mostly on Ryan's experience with behavioral interventions. So, what ideas are important for parents to understand about how the ADHD brain works? Because in my limited experience, I have a 14-year-old with ADHD and I have an 11-year-old without ADHD. And I very quickly realized that even though there are these umbrella ideas that are good for parents in general to manage misconduct and organization, their their brains work very differently. I have to take a very different approach when I deal with the 14-year-old girl versus the 11-year-old boy. And it made me realize that I would imagine a lot of parents may not be up to speed on the specific the specific ways in which ADHD brains function differently from a neurotypical child. So, could we just start? Just give us an overview about how an ADHD brain might work differently than a neurotypical brain.
Sure. Well, I always want to start from a strengths perspective and mention that, because a child has ADHD, that does not mean they're fragile. They are what I call anti-fragile. And I really want people to see their kids as capable and anti-fragile. So that's the first thing to start with. So ADHD does not make you fragile. The next thing is I want people to understand ADHD as a developmental delay in executive functioning. So executive functioning being, what I call the operating system of the brain. So, for children with ADHD, their executive functioning is approximately 2 to 3 years behind their chronological age. So, for instance, a 14-year-old, their executive function age is more at 11 or 12, whereas, a 7-year-old, their executive function age is more, 5 or 4. So, I just want people to keep that in mind, and that does not mean we lower expectations, but it means we meet kids at their executive function age. Now, here are some of the aspects of executive functioning that people are not familiar with. I think when people think of ADHD, they tend to think of the typical things, inattentiveness, hyperactivity,
Mhm,
and those are all valid. And, another way to frame ADHD is we can say it's not difficulty paying attention, it's difficulty regulating your attention to things that are not interesting to you.
mhm.
But when we get more in depth about executive functioning, the one executive function skill that I find is really the catalyst for so much of the behavior and emotional dysregulation challenges we see has to do with cognitive flexibility. So the ability to be adaptable, to, shift when needed, to go with the flow, to be able to accept hearing no. And for children with ADHD who struggle with cognitive flexibility because it's delayed, that often presents as behavior challenges. And this is what I call the executive function skill that never gets talked about because we are so focused on attention and impulsivity and those things. But really, cognitive flexibility is one of the core executive function skills that I want people always to know about. Um, and the
Yeah,
other one, go ahead.
and
Yeah.
also you see, yeah, I picture like a deeper valley for ADHD kids when they do see something that they're interested in.
Mhm.
It is a arguably a deeper focus on that thing than a neurotypical brain.
Yeah, so people with ADHD can hyper focus on things that are interesting to them, and that could actually help them be very
Right.
successful in life, as well. And they tend to go through phases, particularly as kids, where they're interested in something, then they're not, and then they move on to a new interest. That's completely normal.
Mhm. So you were saying that there was aside from the cognitive flexibility, what are some other, things of note?
I think the emotional regulation piece. So, when we talk about that, really what we're talking about is being able to regulate your emotions in a way that's expected for the context of the situation. So, people with ADHD they may be overreactive to things. They may have, a strong sense of what we would call justice sensitivity. So, the feeling that things have to be fair, and if they're not fair, I'm going to make them fair. You know, and with those are things, though, those are skills that can be improved upon. So, because a child with ADHD has difficulty with emotional regulation, that doesn't mean it's out of their control. It is within their control. But again, it's a skill that might be lagging and used inconsistently and can be built upon. So, that's the other thing I should have mentioned. With ADHD, I want people to always understand that it's a condition of inconsistent performance, meaning that your
Mhm.
child might be able to do something well 5 times and then might not be able to do it well for the next 3 times. And then maybe they can do it well 1 time, and then the next 3 times, it seems like that skill is gone. So I think that's the other important thing to note. And with that, the other piece is with kids with ADHD, they tend to live in the moment. So they have difficulty with what I call future thinking skills or nonverbal working memory, which is the ability to visualize something in the future. So a quick example of that, let's say your child does homework and then they forget to hand it in. Well, it's not that they were actually forgetting to hand in the homework, they weren't visualizing themselves handing in the homework. That's a nonverbal working memory piece. The other part of that is they often have difficulty connecting their past experiences with things in the present or future.
Mhm.
So because they live in the moment, they might not remember where, I'll give an example because, when we're recording this, it's close to the summer. So if you say to your child, "Oh, do you want to go back to camp this year?" Where they went last year, and they say, "No, it was boring." Well, they might have had a great time at that camp and enjoyed it, but it's too far out of their time horizon, meaning their ability to visualize the past or present. So they're not remembering the emotions associated with the camp last summer. So they just say automatically it was boring, but they're not really recalling that they had a good time. So
Yeah.
that's thing. And the thing one other thing, if I can mention, that because kids with ADHD live in the moment, this is why traditional talk therapy, play therapy, things like that are not considered evidence based recommended treatments for children with ADHD. You cannot send a child with ADHD to a therapist and they learn, coping skills, and then they're expected to use it a week later. We have to teach things at what's called the point of performance, meaning we have to teach in the moment. And I always want people to understand that because that is one probably the aspect of ADHD that most people do not know, including professionals, that therapy is not an evidence-based recommended treatment for children with ADHD.
Yeah, yeah, it reminds me of this idea that a lot of parents have, which is their first line of defense is often explanation, lots of explanation, lots of questions. One of your videos, you say, don't ask your ADHD child, why did you do that? Because, as you said, they live in the moment. And unlike perhaps a neurotypical brain, oftentimes there isn't a tangible reason or a satisfactory reason for a behavior because it is very impulsive, right? Sometimes a reaction, it just comes out of nowhere. And whereas maybe adults might have access to some of these things, oh, well, I'm hungry and that's why I snapped at you, I'm sorry. Or I'm sorry, I didn't get a lot of sleep last night, so I might be a little irritable. That ADHD kids and a lot of kids in general don't have that kind of access, and it's a huge mistake, it seems to me, to have those expectations.
Yeah, so what you're talking about is what we would call lagging and inconsistent use of internal dialogue. So, for instance, a child with ADHD might do something and it seems impulsive or silly or just bad judgment. And a parent will say, or a teacher or whomever will say, "Why did you do that?" Well, and they say, "I don't know." Well, they could be avoiding wanting to talk about it because they feel ashamed, but most of the time they genuinely don't know because there was no internal dialogue beforehand about what could possibly be the consequences for this. Can I get in trouble? Is this a good idea? So when you have lagging and inconsistent use of that internal dialogue, you tend to do things that seem to not make sense. And then when adults start processing it as, some deep rooted reason behind that, and there has to be a reason, and it start attaching narratives to the behavior,
Mm,
kids often become frustrated. And when they become frustrated, they often get more escalated.
mhm. So let's jump in and talk about what I would guess is probably the biggest issue that you hear from parents, which is dealing with the emotional dysregulation that is more likely with ADHD kids. So, I mean, this could come in the form of an outburst of anger, right? I mean, it could also be a meltdown, mixed with crying. I guess there are a couple ways in which you might see an ADHD kid struggle managing their emotions. But what are some things that trigger these types of emotional outbursts in ADHD children?
Well, I think the thing to keep in mind is that really anything can trigger them. It's not necessarily something that, parents are doing wrong. But certainly, parents with the best of intentions can make things worse sometimes. So here's what I mean by that. I'm not saying this with any blame at all. As I just mentioned before, they tend to talk too much, right? Start asking lots of why questions, start trying to process emotions with the best of intentions, but that often escalates a child.
Yeah.
Another thing is that often adults will give their undivided attention and emotional reactivity to emotional dysregulation and, negative behavior. So what happens? The child learns, well, this behavior is rewarded with attention. And for many kids with ADHD, negative attention, positive attention doesn't make a difference. They would prefer positive attention, but they're fine with negative attention. So things are often exacerbated because they get so much attention and the child learns this behavior is being, reinforced with this because I have an audience. So what it might have been, a 5-minute meltdown that they would have gotten over becomes an hour-long thing because the parent keeps trying with the best of intentions to talk to them and calm them and process emotions. Whereas really the best strategy in those cases would be acknowledge how they're feeling and stop giving it attention. particularly if they're treating others badly or speaking in a way that's not okay.
Can
Um,
you talk a
go ahead.
little
Yeah.
bit more about negative attention? Because it it does seem a little counterintuitive. My ADHD teen is, I would call her sensitive.
Mhm.
She'd if you were to talk to her and ask, do you like it when I raise my voice, it would be a hard no. I don't like it when you raise your voice. But we've had so many cycles of her doing something that clearly is something that would raise my blood pressure a little bit, right? So could you talk a little bit about this negative attention? And
Yeah.
or
So
why what is the gain? What is the dopamine hit that is coming from these engagements?
Yeah. So one thing I guess I want to clarify first is that there's, for anybody who pays attention to any type of neurodiverse parenting social media, there's a lot of these narratives out there that, all behavior is connection seeking. And it's these very emotionally compelling narratives that have no basis in evidence. You know, could behavior be attention seeking because the child wants attention, which we could say is connection? Sure. But to say that every behavior is, connection seeking is just that's something used to sell products to parents. I just want to be clear about that. So why do negative behaviors happen? Well, obviously because the child, as we mentioned, can get stuck that they're not getting their way. That's a flexibility piece. It could be the justice sensitivity piece that they think is something is unfair and they want to make sure that they're going to get justice in this. Could be a strong reaction to somebody else because often they have difficulty putting size of a problem in a relevant context or just tend to be emotionally reactive. So think about how we tend to handle that. Well, if we issue, threats of punishment, well, that often escalates things. If we get into the heavy emotional processing, how did that make you feel? And what I call playing armchair therapist, that escalates many kids with ADHD. That's another thing. And look, in some cases, the ADHD brain tends to be novelty seeking. They like things that are new. They like things that are exciting. So particularly when they're bored, they tend to engage in novelty seeking behaviors, which can mean being provocative, negative attention seeking. And they're not doing that necessarily to upset anybody. They're doing it because they're bored and they need that dopamine hit as you said. And that's how they get it because look, negative attention can get others' attention very quickly. So one of the things I teach parents is, to not give attention to novelty seeking behaviors. And we have to help kids learn how to replace that by creating some scaffolding, by giving them some structure, limiting their options when necessary, those types of things.
Mhm. And so in terms of like the top, I don't know, 3 things to keep
Mhm.
in mind when when tensions are at when that emotions, when you're in the midst of that meltdown, you say not to reward that type of behavior. What does that mean? Because I know you talk about how the importance of what you call affective calmness, but how do you, what are the 3 things that you would recommend that someone keep in mind when they're in the middle of their child's meltdown?
Yeah. So, number one, affective calmness is a term that I use to mean, you can present calmness even when you don't feel calm inside. People often refer to that as co regulation, but I think that term co regulation has become very confusing for a lot of parents. I think they often think that means, sit right next to your child and talk to them and process, emotions through things, the things that actually escalate many kids. A very popular parenting, person on social media who I won't name, they tell people, even if your kid is saying, "Go away, leave me alone," stay with them no matter what. I think that's a horrible idea. If they want
Yeah.
space, that's what they need to calm down, respect that and give them space. So I don't believe in that whole approach, and that's not really supported by evidence, either. So the number one thing is affective calmness. Try to model calmness even when you don't feel calm inside, because that is teaching emotional regulation skills. Okay. Number two is my saying, give, purposeful recognition and praise to the behaviors you want. Do not give attention or emotional reactivity to the behaviors you don't want. That does not mean ignoring your child. It means not giving attention to those specific behaviors. And this is something also when what I teach is that when parents change, the way they handle these behaviors, we want to tell the child ahead of time at a calm time, right? That how we're going to be responding differently to them because we don't want to surprise them in the moment. We want them to know exactly what to expect. So that would be, number 2. And number 3, I always want people to, understand that we need to have expectations in place for behavior, cooperation and how family members are treated. And there is no one and done. So there's no, you messed up once, now, you lost this. I don't believe in that kind of reactive parenting. What I teach is we give, opportunities for self-correction. My saying is actually we're not looking for perfection. We give opportunities for self-correction. So for instance, if the expectation is cooperation within 2 times of being asked, or to go take a break, or whatever, to speak respectfully within 2 times of being asked, we give them those opportunities to self-correct because again, that's also teaching emotional regulation.
Yeah, I've definitely embraced the phrase "try again" because, having I have 2, they're stepkids, so I have limited experience with them. I only have a couple years kind of learning their patterns of behavior. And, the 14-year-old, she's the one with ADHD. Um, Try again has been helpful because at least it reinforces the idea in my head that this isn't about total obedience.
Mhm,
It's not about punishment. It's not about making them feel bad when they lose control. It's always about fostering and scaffolding, and n the now we've had moderate success with try again, which is so, for example, this is a nice transition to what I wanted to talk about next, which is, disrespectful language.
mhm,
Uh, I start from the point that, well, maybe she's probably not aware when she is using disrespectful language. So forget the whole punishment, immediate reactive. Let's do the try again. And we've agreed that try again means that when I say try again, that is an indicator to her that something that she said might be perceived as disrespectful. Um, I would say it works about 75% of the time. 75% of the time, she will go ahead and rephrase it, try to not
mhm,
yell, and but, there's still some issues with, there's still a certain amount of defiance that tends to persist, and I think it's more emotional. I think that the emotion that negative emotion might be a little deeper when she pushes back, but,
mhm,
could you talk a little bit more about this, like a scaffolding, as you said, approach versus the reactive, like as soon as you do something like immediate consequence, which
mhm.
I think some parents might think is necessary.
Yeah. So one of the things I want to clarify is there's a difference between consequences and punishments.
Okay.
There's, again, I feel like I need to say there's a lot of, very emotionally compelling narratives on social media about, children with ADHD don't need punishments. They just need love and connection. And my response to that is, how is that going to work when they're out in the real world? Right? There is no culture in the world that does not exist without consequences. So, in terms of consequences, what they do need is natural consequences, not ones that we impose arbitrarily based on our emotional reaction to things. So, the way we get around that is we have daily expectations in place. I teach, we vary the number of these, based on the child's age. And we split them, again, between helping around the house, cooperation, and how family members are treated. And on top of that, we break them up throughout the day. So let's say, your child has a difficult morning. Well, their currency, which they earn for meeting expectations, it's not that they lost it for the whole day. They might have not earned it for that period of the day. So there is no one and done here. We give them multiple opportunities throughout the day to earn their currency, the thing that motivates them to meet expectations. And then on top of that, if they don't meet expectations, we don't say, you've lost this, I'm taking away. Right. What we say is, you chose not to, earn your YouTube time this morning. I hope you'll make a different choice after school. That's it. So I call that language of accountability because we're teaching them accountability and they choose whether they earn, their privileges or currency, or not. And that's really what I mean by scaffolding. And the reason I teach this is the number one problem I see in families of kids with ADHD is what I call high giving, low expectations, meaning parents give and give and give, and little to nothing is expected of the child in return. So, what happens with that? Well, it often creates children who appear very entitled and selfish at home, but are not like that outside the home, or the way their emotional regulation skills look very different outside the home than it does in the home. You know, so when we have expectations of kids that are age appropriate, tied to earning their currency and broken up throughout the day, so they have multiple opportunities to earn. That's what that scaffolding looks like.
Yeah, I've really been doing a lot of research on this idea of of talking about the positives and using reward versus punishment.
Hmm.
It seems to be far more effective to grant and reinforce when children do things how you like them to, versus that that snap, oh, you lost screen time, oh, you lost this. um but I still see situations that are a little bit more complex, which is, you know, in order for parents to execute this properly, they have to have a a set of clear expectations, and I
Yes,
think oftentimes parents don't have that. And even in our house, where we have family values all over the place, that we've written 5 of them down, and we talk about them every month.
that's
But
great.
then we also run into situations where one of the children will do something, and it's like, "Oh, well, we didn't have an expectation there. Can we punish them?" I get a little trigger shy levying consequences when there wasn't a clear expectation set. So,
Yeah,
what do you recommend in these more nuanced cases where you don't wanna just say, "Because I said so"?
yeah. So that's I'm glad you brought that up because I do teach parents never to say because I said so, because for people with ADHD, they often need a clear reason for things, and they can stop hyper focusing on something and they can get unstuck often when they have a clear reason. Doesn't mean it'll happen immediately, but they need that. They need to have a clear reason. So with expectations, one of the things we have to do is make them really clear and specific and understand, right, you can't target every single little thing. But for instance, for a child who has a propensity to be oppositional, we can have an expectation of cooperation within 2 times of being asked. For a child who, starts to, speak in a way that's not okay, we can say, speak in the same way we speak to you within 2 times of being asked, or go take a brain break. That's my term for meaning go have some space and you can come back, basically like you're try again. But I frame it as giving them some space so they can get to a better state of self-regulation. Okay.
Mhm.
So so right, you can't cover everything with it, but we can certainly create, these expectations that are based on, just very basic things such as how we speak to people, how we treat others. And part of the reason why this is so important is, for a lot of adults with ADHD, they still struggle with how they speak to people. A lot of adults with ADHD can come off very abrasive or insensitive or speak in a way that's not respectful. And to be honest, because many of them were never called out on this when they were younger, and they were never taught that you are not entitled to speak to people however you want. So the earlier we teach this, the better.
So let's get hyper specific for a moment with a situation where a child might be using very disrespectful
Hmm.
language. Okay, and we'll even remove the emotions for. Let's just say they're not angry.
Hmm.
It's just a reaction where they're using
Yeah.
language that you don't accept.
Hmm.
Now, what are some options for parents? Because I've encountered this on occasion, and if in the case of my 14-year-old, if she raises her voice, I oftentimes will end the conversation, which you kind of mentioned, giving some time for your brain to reset or relax. But in these very specific moments where the children are using disrespectful language, what are some things that you can keep in mind?
Yeah, so this is one of the ones I find particularly fathers have a hard time with. Many kids with ADHD, let me kind of do this in tiers. Many kids with ADHD will often complain or argue when they're not getting their way, when something isn't happening as quickly as they want, or they're faced with having to do a non-preferred task. So I call that noise, arguing or complaining for the sake of arguing or complaining. And I teach do not give attention or emotional reactivity to noise. Now, let's say it escalates to more, disrespectful language. My advice would be for most, in most cases, that do not give attention to it. Because again, what we want the child to learn is that, you are not going to be rewarded with attention or my emotional reactivity because of the way you're speaking. And people will say, well, how can I let them get away with it? It's not about letting them get away with it. That's not what you're doing. What you're doing is teaching them this is not going to be rewarded with my attention. I'm not going to engage with you when you speak this way. And that's what they need to understand. This is not the way you engage with people. Because again, something I want people to understand is many adults with ADHD still engage with people by being highly argumentative. I think that has something to do with the fact that many of them have difficulty keeping jobs. I mean, look, I've been at this for
Mhm.
years. I can tell you for a fact, that many adults with ADHD, even if they leave comments on my videos or social media, the way that they engage is just not appropriate. So this is something the earlier we can teach, the better. And of course, I'm not talking about all people with ADHD, you know, but the next tier from that, I would say is, um, if they get to the level of what we would call emotional blackmail, which is very common amongst kids with ADHD. So as an example, today when I did office hours for my membership site, a parent was saying that, her daughter saying that if she has to go back to her school next year, which she doesn't want to do because she has, some anxiety about things, that she threatens to kill herself. Okay, that's what we would call severe tyrannical behaviors. It's emotional blackmail used to coerce or assert control in situations. For that, have an evidence-based protocol where we enlist other people to support the child. And in that case, what we would do is actually sit in the emergency room of a hospital for hours and waiting for a psych evaluation because that is a natural consequence for using emotional blackmail. So for typical, just for kind of disrespectful language, I tell people as hard as this is, just try not to give it any attention or emotional reactivity because we want the child to learn you're not going to engage with me this way.
This is very interesting. Go ahead.
So I just want to mention, then the other thing is that what I teach is about the concept of cleanups. So making amends after you've said or done something hurtful. Because for many kids with ADHD, they will just, speak in a horrible way and then be over it and expect everybody else to be over it. So by having them do a cleanup is, the idea of, actions speak louder than words. So the way you spoke to mom, was not okay. Can you help her set the table for dinner? You know, or dad was trying to help you and you were really not, it was not appropriate the way you were yelling at him, can you help him with this? So the idea of a cleanup is making amends to the person who you've said or done something hurtful towards, because that's also teaching, reciprocity in relationships and repair.
I really like what you said about about not giving attention. I think this is a subtle point because, as you mentioned, if, even in adults, for example, when they're oftentimes you see adults mistreated by someone in public, and when they're mistreated, they go towards in like, "Why did you do that? I don't deserve to be treated like that." And what adults don't realize is you're keeping the interaction going, and it's oftentimes, as you say, the more subtle approach of not of the absence of meeting them at that level of arousal that is the most effective. Um, as a follow-up, my 14-year-old's getting a little bit older, and I definitely avoid at all costs raising my voice, and I'm trying and I'm embracing this idea of being stoic and trying to keep that affective calmness. However, uh, staying calm when your child is entering into adolescence a little bit older, they might at a later time criticize that as being disinterested. You're not, you're ignoring me. How does, that doesn't make me feel good. How can you stay calm when I'm this irritated? Could you talk a little bit about what a conversation with an ADHD teen might look like if
Mhm.
they're frustrated with your reactions and maybe they're interpreting it as I don't care.
Okay. Well, the one thing, as I mentioned before, is we always want to tell kids when we're changing our response to their behavior so there are no surprises. So if you're going to start ignoring when they speak to you that way, and not respond to that, we explain to them ahead of time that we're doing that. All right. So that's the number one thing. The other thing to understand is many kids with ADHD do use emotional blackmail, different levels, maybe not the suicidal threats, but you don't care about me, you don't care about how I feel, you love my brother more than me, those kind of things. And what happens is that works profoundly well on mothers, I will say. And often what do they do? No, I do. And they start jumping in with reassurance, right? And then that whole dynamic has changed because now the child has learned, oh, look, I upset my mother. I can get them to, maybe give in to what I want, even though I'm speaking in this way because I did something or I said something that triggered them. So for that lower level, I guess I'll call it, of emotional blackmail, again, you don't respond to it. If they want to speak about something later, you can ask them, "Did you want to talk about that?" And if they don't, then respect that and don't try to push it. One of the ways I've seen many families with the best of intentions re-escalate their kids is, after an incident, we have to sit down and talk about this and process the incident. And I felt this way. And then you said this. That often just makes things worse. So if we tell the child how we're going to be responding ahead of time, they know what to expect. They know we're not going to respond to, the lower level emotional blackmail type statements, and then giving them an opportunity to problem solve afterwards, not just process feelings because that's, what people tend to go to, but really, to problem solve, then we can always give them that opportunity. But I do want to explain, it's important to stay away from conversations about what would you do differently next time, because that sounds great in theory, but again, the ADHD brain lives in the moment. Talking about what they can do differently next time, there's not going to be any carryover to that for next time.
I was just going to bring that up, which is to say, what are parents to do when the behavior that they're trying to curb occurs outside of the home. So for at school, for example, right? Because you emphasize that the modification has to be at the point of application. That right. So what do we do when the situation is outside of the home?
Well, it kind of depends really on the context of the situation, but I would basically give the same advice, So, for instance, when my son I'll give this example with my son who has ADHD and was the poster child for, what we would call oppositional defiant disorder, a label I hate, but he really fitted the description when he was younger. We would be at Target and he would see the Pokemon cards and would want something, and then I would say no, and that became a whole thing, and he would start carrying on in front of the Pokemon cards. Well, I wasn't gonna sit there and beg and plead with him or try to reason with him. I said, "Okay, I'm leaving. I'll see you." And I would basically go and wait outside the store. And I knew nothing was gonna happen to him because he's in a store, it's self-contained. I'm right outside, but that's an example of I wasn't gonna feed into his getting stuck on not getting Pokemon cards, even when he started creating a scene. So as difficult as it might be for people, the same principles apply. We give purposeful recognition and praise to the behaviors we want. Do not give emotional reactivity or attention to the behaviors you don't want. And you know what? In some
Okay.
cases,
Okay.
somebody might judge you because of that. But that's their judgment their judgment does not dictate how you parent because they don't have to live with your child and they don't have to raise your child. That's what I always tell people.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think I might have miscommunicated a little bit. So, I think that makes sense for being out in public. I get the example that I'm curious about that I'd like your take on is if the behavior is happening at school, right? If your child is at school and they're either consistently, snapping at other kids,
Mhm,
or they're emotionally dysregulated at school, or they're trying to, you're trying to get them to talk to their teachers more or something like that.
mhm,
And as we mentioned earlier, that, they're not visualizing themselves doing
mhm,
it. But, specifically in the case of, let's say, of let's say emotional an impulse control issue, so that they're getting it handsy with kids at school or something like that. And I'm sure this is going to vary by age, of course, but if conversations about here's what we need to do next time aren't really going to work, what can you do when the child is outside of the home and the parents aren't there?
Okay. So a few things. When if we'll use your example with school, if they're getting handsy is an impulsivity issue, again, the only things that help with impulsivity and attention are brain maturity and med management. You cannot do anything to teach better impulse control or help them focus better on things that are not interesting. It's meds and brain maturity. That's what the research shows.
And
So
I wanna cut you off because that's
yeah,
so important to understand. Like, there are so many there's so many levers that as a parent you think are in front of you. You think that if I just pull this lever and convince them that this is how they need to be, just one more conversation, and they will start to apply that messaging when they're out in the world. And it seems to me like what you're saying is very softly to not have that expectation.
yeah, I mean, I definitely feel that people should teach their family values. I think that's extremely important for all families, right? But at the end of the day, when they're out in school or out in other places in the community, the reality is you have no control over your child's behavior. People have difficulty hearing that. I get this question all the time. This has happened in my child's school. What can I do to help? You cannot do anything to control their behavior at school. What we can do is help them develop perspective taking skills. So if they're struggling with peers, that's often because they have lagging and inconsistent use of perspective taking. So understanding others' thoughts, and understanding how they're coming across to others. That is a skill that takes a very long time to develop, but we can certainly teach it. I mean, I have a course focused on that. And beyond that, like in school, what we can do is we can ask the school to do what's called a functional behavior assessment to help determine, why some of these behaviors are occurring with the intention of hopefully putting in place what's called a positive behavior support plan, or sometimes they're called behavior intervention plans. They're called different things at different, schools. But really, that's the best thing with school is to have the school look at the function of the behavior and have them put something in place because there's nothing you can do to change your child's behavior when they're in school or out in the community. Asides, teach your family values. Teach them perspective taking when it comes to relationships with others, and they understand how they're coming across, and have expectations of how others should be treated, and
Yeah.
how we behave in public. But again, at the end of the day, that's teaching our family values, right? It's not something we can control.
Yeah. Yeah, and you used the word inconsistent earlier, and it's so fascinating because sometimes to both of my kids, I'll use certain phrases over and over again. Well, I mean, try again is sort of behavioral modification, but I'll also use another phrase like, we speak kindly and clear to everyone and stuff like that. And on some occasions they will reference that exact wording. And I think, it wasn't a conversation in anger. It's just part of our values. And if you do repeat certain, catchy, pithy phrases that they might not always act consistent with it, but it's in there. Um, so let's pivot a little bit because we've been talking mostly about emotional dysregulation and misconduct, but there's another large area of note when it comes to working with ADHD kids, supporting them at home, and that is going back to a point that you mentioned right at the top, which is that ADHD kids often lack the motivation to engage in activities that do not have an immediate benefit, right? So if you have an ADHD child, you probably notice that they have that deep attention valley for things that interest them, Legos and gaming and stuff like that. And a completely different approach to things like chores and schoolwork, right? Right, because there is no intrinsic value to them. They don't see it, and it doesn't matter how much of a pitch you give them to about this is important later on in life. Do you want to work someday? Do you want work skills? You're wasting your breath. And I think this is also true for just children in general. I don't think this is true for ADHD kids specifically, but Uh, when parents think about creating an environment at home to get their children in general or ADHD kids comfortable with a chore structure, with getting in a routine with schoolwork, what are some things that parents need to keep in mind when creating that structure at home?
Well, I think the first thing I want to mention is that you don't need your child's buy-in to create structure at home. We don't need them to get comfortable with having to do chores or homework or whatever. That's part of life, right? Everybody has to do that. So they might not like it. They might make a lot of noise, and that's okay. They're entitled to feel however they want about it. So it's not something that we have to convince them of. And often people will say to me, how do I convince my child to take meds? And I have a specific response for that, but you don't convince them, you tell them this is how things work in our family. So one of the things I think that often, and this is kind of a, more, zooming out type of answer, but people often are fearful of stepping into their parental authority for their child's benefit. Many parents have been misled to believe that being authoritative means being cold, insensitive, not respecting your child's feelings. We have decades and decades of research data that shows authoritative parenting, which is love and warmth combined with clear expectations, boundaries, and limits, is the most effective parenting approach for all children, produces the best mental health outcomes. And here's something we know for children with ADHD. Children with ADHD who are raised with an authoritative parenting approach are more well liked by their peers than children who are raised with a more permissive, indulgent parenting approach or an authoritarian, which is a militaristic style parenting approach. So I think that's the first thing is that you need to not be scared of stepping into your parental authority because the ADHD brain tends to be very concrete. Kids need things spelled out. They need things to be specific. So the more clarity we provide them, the easier things are going to be for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I noticed immediately, when it came uh, to when I moved in with my current wife and we were kinda tinkering with the chore routine, I noticed very quickly that as the adult, you have to shed this idea that you can expect children to do simple tasks right the first time. I mean, I think my expectations were too high immediately, and I was like, to the adult, it's simple, like cleaning your room as a classic example. It seems self-explanatory. Okay, did you clean your room? Clean your room. Your room's not clean. And
Mhm.
I very quickly realized that I need to put on that hat of scaffolding and saying, well, let me walk you through what a clean room is defined as. It gets very academic, but uh, it seemed to land when I started to say, okay, things on the floor have a home; they need to be at home. Um, uh, do you find that parents, often, you know, they stumble when they're trying to like, they just skip right to the "Did you do it or not" when it comes to these small type of household chores?
Well, here's the thing I want to mention first. I think parents are not given much education about executive functioning. What they're basically told is it means academic organizational skills, which is not accurate at all. So for your example, which is perfect of cleaning the room, I teach a strategy that we have to have a picture of what the room's supposed to look like when it's clean, and we break the room up into zones. So we break it up spatially to make it feel, easier to handle, but they need that visual example of what it looks like because when they don't have that, what tends to happen in families is kids tend to remain prompt dependent, meaning parents say, pick this up, go do this, go do that. When kids are prompt dependent, the adults in their life are acting as their executive functioning, so they don't get to use or develop their own executive functioning. Or the other thing is that often, parents see this as like, a behavior issue. He won't clean his room. Well, it's not that he won't, it's that he doesn't know where to start and doesn't know what the end result should look like. So that's a type of scaffolding, we can put in place to help build executive functioning. But again, what I find is that often nobody explains this to people, and I'm going to be perfectly honest here. Most of the strategies out there for kids with ADHD are kind of these generic strategies that work fine for adults, but really don't work for kids with ADHD. Maybe they don't work at all. They could work for a week and then they don't work anymore. So scaffolding that is, visual. And then the other, part about that is how we use our language. So we shift from prompting language constantly to, instead of saying, pick this up, pick that up, to, can you make that part of the room look like it's supposed to look in the picture? So they have to use their own internal dialogue. That's part of it. The other thing, if I could just mention real quick, many kids with ADHD learn that learned helplessness is a very effective strategy to have people rescue you from non-preferred tasks. So a lot of kids with ADHD, sometimes they'll say this out of frustration. They'll say, "I can't do it. I don't know how." Or they'll start the self-defeating comments. "I'm stupid." Well, it might be because they don't have scaffolding in place, which they need to, complete the task. But other times it's because they've learned, if I say this, people rescue me. My parent will come in and give me reassurance and clean the room for me when I act helpless. Very common amongst kids with ADHD.
You mentioned prompt dependence, and I wanted to dive a little deeper there because isn't it true that if you look at the actual like the age development, that at some point when your kids are much younger, they need you to help with the prompt dependence. You need at
Mhm.
some point they need you to say, did you remember to pack your bag? Did you remember to brush your teeth?" And is it the case that they need it and then they should be weaned off of it, and that parents don't normally do the weaning off of it part?
Well, here's the thing, it's different for every child. I don't think, we can say at this age they, should absolutely be able to do this because every child's developmental trajectory is different. But what I want people to understand this as is that, this prompt dependence comes from this lack of internal dialogue, or should say inconsistent use of internal dialogue, what I call brain voice with kids, combined with difficulty with the nonverbal working memory of visualizing what's supposed to come next. So we can help kids develop this by the way we use language, by like I mentioned, having visual strategies. And the other thing is, we can start developing this early. So yes, we do have to prompt sometimes, but we can also say instead of "Did you brush your teeth?" "Did you do everything on your timeline?" Meaning a visual sequence of pictures of the child doing these sequence of steps, not a list, not some cute pictures we cut out from the internet, but of the child doing the steps. Because the more we get them to use their internal dialogue, the more we will help them, develop this, their internal dialogue. So that's the one thing. And then the other thing is, again, it's really easy for all of us to just prompt because that's the easiest thing to do. It's a lot harder to get our kids to have to think and use their internal dialogue, and that's often frustrating for them because we're requiring them to think. But it's so important for executive function skill development.
Yeah, and as we wrap up, I can definitely sympathize with all parents in general, parents of ADHD kids. Some of this might feel like you're drinking from a fire hose, which is pretty normal.
Mhm.
As you said, there aren't really there is no book on parenting. It's that old phrase. Um, we've spent uh, almost an hour talking about uh, misconduct. We've talked about motivation from the perspective of the parent. To wrap up, w- could you tell the listeners what ADHD kids most need their parents to understand about them in order to feel good, to feel effective?
Yeah. Number 1, I think to remember that, they are not fragile, they are anti-fragile, that they are capable, even when they appear that they're not capable or think that they're not capable, they are more capable than you realize and likely more than they realize. And I think the most important thing I would say is that kids with ADHD need to feel useful. When they don't feel useful, they exhibit immature and entitled behaviors at home that are not exhibited outside the home. And, as I mentioned before, with this high giving, low expectations, so many kids with ADHD are never meant to feel useful at home. So even if they complain about doing chores, even if they complain about having, non-preferred, demands placed on them, it's so incredibly important that they feel useful and feel like they're contributing. And that is throughout their life. People with ADHD often need to feel productive and feel useful, and they don't feel good when they're not.
Well, thank you so much. It has been a pleasure to talk to you today, Ryan Wexelblatt.
Thank you so much for having me. Great talking to you.
enjoy this podcast, please share an episode with 2 of your friends. Head over to patreon.com/whydowethatpodcast to become a paid supporter of the show. You'll gain early access to episodes as well as bonus video content. Follow on Instagram or Facebook at Why Do We Do That Podcast, or on X at WDWDTpod. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?